So let's dive right into a question that really gets to the core of Christian theology. Did Jesus raise himself from the dead? Now, the answer you might find in the scriptures, well, it might not be what you think.
Look, we all know the resurrection is a cornerstone of the Christian faith. It's absolutely central. But if you look closely, the Bible actually presents a surprisingly consistent story about how that amazing event went down. So let's put on our investigator hats. Who did the scripture say was the one actually doing the work in the resurrection? To answer a big question like this, we can't just cherry pick verses that seem to fit. We need a rule book, a guiding principle for our investigation. It's a key part of biblical interpretation. The fancy word is hermeneutics, and it's going to help us be fair to the text. And here is that principle, maybe the most important one of all. You could call it the golden rule of interpretation. You let the clear passages explain the less clear passages. It's just common sense, right? You don't build a major foundational belief on one or two confusing verses while you've got dozens of other ones that are crystal clear. The clear stuff has to be your foundation.
So let's lay out our case file. On one side, you have the claim that Jesus raised himself. That idea really leans on just two specific passages. But on the other side, you've got this massive body of evidence. We're talking over 30 passages, all pointing in a totally different direction. So if we're following our golden rule, we've got to start with that overwhelming evidence. All right, let's get into it. Let's really look at this mountain of evidence. We're going to see what these clear, straight-to-the-point passages tell us again and again and again about the resurrection. And yeah, you heard that right. That number isn't a typo. More than 30 times the New Testament says flat out that it was God the Father who raised Jesus from the dead. This isn't some side note. It's a constant, central theme that the apostles keep coming back to. Just take a look at the Apostle Peter's very first sermon on the day of Pentecost. He couldn't be more direct. He doesn't say Jesus broke free on his own. He says God raised him up. Think about that. This was the very first public announcement of the gospel message, and this is how Peter explained it. Then you've got the Apostle Paul, who makes this a core part of the salvation message itself. And notice how specific he is. You have to believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. It's presented as absolutely essential for salvation. Paul even takes it a step further. He actually defines his own authority as an apostle by this very fact. And notice how he draws a clear distinction between the players here. Through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him. He very clearly separates the one who was raised from the one who did the raising. The distinction is right there in the text. Now, beyond these direct statements, there's another really powerful clue hiding in plain sight. It's in the grammar. Almost every single time Jesus or the apostles talk about the resurrection, they use what's called the passive voice. This structure means an action was done to Jesus, not by him. So when you hear things like, he will be raised, or he was raised, or Christ has not been raised, it's all pointing to an outside power, an external agent acting on him. Okay, so with this absolute mountain of evidence showing us a super clear pattern, let's circle back to those two verses that seem a little different. It's time to go back and re-examine those passages in John's Gospel that are often used to make the opposite case. So here's the first key verse. Jesus has just cleared the temple, and they ask him for a sign of his authority. On the surface, his answer seems pretty clear. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. But we have to remember our rule. One single, kind of cryptic statement shouldn't be used to overturn dozens of perfectly clear ones. And here's the best part. We don't actually have to guess what Jesus meant, because just a few verses later, the author of the gospel himself, John, gives us his own inspired interpretation of what happened, looking back after the resurrection. And there it is. Look at how he phrases it. The author himself uses the passive voice, he was raised, to explain what Jesus said earlier. So John, the writer of this very gospel, interprets Jesus' mysterious words in a way that lines up perfectly with all the other evidence, that it was God who performed the action of raising Jesus. So how do we make sense of Jesus saying, I will raise it up? Well, a really consistent way to understand it, especially with all this evidence, is that Jesus was speaking prophetically, in the voice of God the Father. This was common in the Old Testament. Prophets would often speak in the first person, as if they were God, saying, I will do this, when they really meant God would do it. It seems Jesus is doing the same thing here. He's declaring the incredible act that God the Father was going to do. Now let's look at that second key passage from John's Gospel. Jesus says he has the authority to lay his life down and the authority to take it again. The real key to unlocking this verse is in one little Greek word for take, which is lambano.
You see, the word lambano can mean a couple of things. It can mean to take, like an active grabbing or seizing, but it also very often means to receive, which is more passive. And the clue to which meaning is right is hiding in the exact same verse. At the end, Jesus clarifies, "This charge I have received from my Father." And guess what? The word for received there is also lambano. So the most consistent way to read the whole sentence is that Jesus has authority from the Father to receive his life back from the Father. So we've looked at the evidence, we've looked at the grammar, we've looked at the context, but you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but why does this matter so much? Isn't this just splitting theological hairs? And the answer is not at all. This distinction has massive implications for the entire Christian faith. Seeing it this way has four huge theological payoffs. First, it keeps the Father in his unique role as the ultimate giver of life. Second, it lines up perfectly with the core message the apostles were preaching day in and day out. Third, and this is so important, it's what grounds the hope of resurrection for all of us. I mean, think about it. If Jesus raised himself just because he was uniquely divine, what hope would that give a normal human being? But if God raised the human Jesus, that becomes a powerful promise that God can do the same for us. And finally, it shows that death is a state of real powerlessness, a state that only the incredible power of God can reverse. So, at the end of the day, when you look at all the evidence together, the story the Bible is telling isn't about a divine being who was kind of immune to death and just brought himself back through his own power. No, the biblical story is something far more powerful. It's about God making a promise to all of humanity, saying that death doesn't get the final word. And that promise was proven, it was guaranteed, through the ultimate display of God's power, raising the Messiah, a real human being from the grave. This makes Jesus the firstborn from the dead, the pioneer for every single person who puts their trust in that promise. And that really leaves us with this final question to chew on. If the resurrection isn't a story about what a divine being did for himself, but is instead the story of what God the Father did for his faithful human Son, and through him did for all of us, how does that change the way we understand this foundational story of hope and divine power?